is to give her children the physical and affectionate guardianship necessary not alone to keep them from falling into social misfortune, but more affirmatively, to rear them into citizens capable of contributing to society. The American and German governments built thousands of new housing units, providing jobs in construction and low-cost shelter for formerly unemployed workers, and both governments advertised these facts. The discipline of a democracy. In both the U.S. and Germany, censorship of the press increased dramatically during the era of the New Deal and Nazism. But more often, the press censored itself to support the state, avoid punishment, or simply to abide by the norms of culture that were increasingly hostile to free expression. In Germany, hundreds of journalists enthusiastically joined the Ministry of Propaganda. For others, mere knowledge of the consequences of non-compliance with the often unwritten rules sufficed to encourage most of them to toe the line and enforce the most effective and invisible form of control: self-censorship. In the U.S., there was some heavy-handed censorship, but far more willing submission by the press itself. Roosevelt appointed loyalists to the Federal Communications Commission, who made it clear that licenses would be revoked for broadcasters who aired programs critical of the government. In 1934, the Yankee Radio Network of New England promised to give the president a lot of support after it received warnings from an FCC commissioner. An executive for another network said that the fear of government intervention would blue pencil a dozen programs for every one that an official censor might object to. In the first weeks of the Roosevelt administration, NBC instituted a policy barring the president's critics from its broadcasts. Henry Bellows of CBS told Roosevelt's press secretary immediately after the inauguration that the close contact between you and the broadcasters has tremendous possibilities of value to the administration, and as a lifelong Democrat, I want to pledge my best efforts in making this cooperation successful. In 1935, CBS celebrated the second anniversary of the New Deal with Of the People, By the People, For the People, a program in which professional actors recreated great moments in the administration's first 2 years. The U.S. Office of Education mandated that civics classes in public schools play the 2-hour program for students. Boke Carter of CBS was the most popular political commentator until 1938, when he was fired for his increasingly critical remarks about the president. Both CBS and NBC continued to ban critics of the New Deal through the 1930s and into the war. Hollywood, the chief transmitter of national social norms, underwent a profound transformation during the New Deal. As we have seen in the 1920s and especially in the early 1930s, rogues were the heroes of the silver screen, as Hollywood movies reflected and promoted the sexual liberation and disregard for authority that were evident in American culture at the time. The Catholic Church and other moral reformers pressured Hollywood to clean up its movies. In 1930, the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, better known as the Hays Office after its chairman, Will Hays, issued a code of self-censorship for the industry. But it was not enforced for several years. According to Hays, Hollywood and America were not yet ready to limit their freedom of expression. Trying to preach morality in a cataclysm of that sort was like a voice sounding off in the desert, he said. The so-called Hays Code was not implemented until March 6, 1933, 2 days after Roosevelt took office. This indicated, according to film historian Giuliano Muschio, author of the only scholarly study of the subject, that the industry was afraid that an administration that championed federal intervention like the New Deal would interfere with film affairs. That is, the studio chiefs understood that if they didn't censor themselves, Washington would do it for them. The Hays Code was as thoroughgoing a restriction of expression as any system of censorship imposed in Germany and Italy. It also far outlived the Nazi and fascist regimes. for more than 32 years until it was replaced in 1967 by the film rating system. Virtually all motion pictures produced in the United States adhered to the code. To begin, the code stated broadly, "No picture shall be produced that will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Only correct standards of life, subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented." The third section of the code, which mandated that law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, was undoubtedly well received by a federal government that was then producing a massive and unprecedented system of regulatory laws. The depiction of sexuality was severely restricted. The sanctity of the institution of marriage and the home shall be upheld, the code stated. Pictures shall not infer that low forms of sex relationship are the accepted or common thing. More to the point, scenes of passion should not be introduced when not essential to the plot. What were the forbidden low forms of sexuality? Excessive and lustful kissing, lustful embraces, suggestive postures and gestures are not to be shown. In general, passion should so be treated that these scenes do not stimulate the lower and baser element. Of course, sex perversion, referring to homosexuality, or any inference to it, is forbidden. But so was white slavery, miscegenation, sex relationships between the white and black races, mention of sex hygiene and venereal disease, and even indecent movements in dancing. To keep audiences from drawing illicit connections, the treatment of bedrooms must be governed by good taste and delicacy. The scenes of actual childbirth, in fact or in silhouette, are never to be presented. In language virtually identical to the Third Reich's laws against degenerative art, the code proclaimed that it was intended to produce correct entertainment and prevent the creation of wrong entertainment that lowers the whole living conditions and moral ideals of a race. While the Nazis were purging German museums of thousands of works of immoral art, the most popular art form in the United States was being produced according to a set of rules organized around the belief that art can be morally evil in its effects. This was the case clearly enough with unclean art, indecent books, suggestive drama. It is well known that the state and the media were merged in Italy and Germany. In the United States, the merger of the New Deal and Hollywood was less formal, but no less complete. It began even before Roosevelt was elected. In September 1932, Jack Warner of Warner Brothers staged the motion picture electrical parade and sports pageant at Los Angeles Olympic Stadium, which according to Muschio was a spectacle in the style of a gigantic Busby Berkeley film and an unequivocal political promotion of Roosevelt as a presidential candidate. It featured giant electrical floats and human geometrics of bodies reminiscent of the mass choreography typical of Nazism. Warner Brothers continued to be an unofficial propagandist for the New Deal after the election. In 1933, the studio released The Road is Open Again, which served precisely the function performed by the Nazi propaganda offices. In this film, the spirits of Presidents Washington, Lincoln, and Wilson praised the current president. Washington: "Well, Abe, it looks as though we can stop worrying about our country. Roosevelt has it headed right again." Lincoln: "All it needed was a plan of action, and a man with the courage to carry it through." Wilson: "There isn't a person in America who won't benefit by the NRA, if every man, woman, and child does his part." Washington: "You can always depend on Americans." Another Warner Brothers film released in 1933, a box office smash called Footlight Parade, features a grand finale choreographed by Busby Berkeley, in which marching soldiers form themselves into images of an American flag, a portrait of FDR, and the NRA eagle. Other studios did their share for the New Deal as well. Fox's biggest star in the early 1930s was Will Rogers, who was also the leading supporter of the New Deal in American popular culture. Rogers had been a vaudeville and silent movie star in the 1910s and 1920s, but he gained his greatest fame during the first 3 years of the Roosevelt administration. He starred in 12 films between 1933 and 1935, and during that time established what came to be known as the Will Rogers formula. Typically, Rogers played a plain, pure-of-heart character from a rural town who is victimized by big city businessmen. The plot normally involved the collective work of ordinary Americans like himself to overcome their oppression. In nearly all of his films, work, in particular direct physical labor carried out cooperatively and for the community rather than for individual gain, is portrayed as noble, while the desire for material comforts and luxuries is shown as the source of corruption. Rogers campaigned vigorously for Roosevelt in the 1932 election, then used his radio show to promote New Deal policies. He called himself the #1 New Dealer. Rogers was also a great admirer of another world leader. "Mussolini, he's the biggest thing in the world today," he said on a speaking tour in 1927, 1 year after he met Il Duce in Italy. "Anyone who can put those Dagos to work is some guy." Later, in a speech to a crowd of his fans, the #1 New Dealer praised Mussolini's militarism. "He knows the nations that are great are the ones that have something in the way of sidearms. He knows that without an army and navy, they will never be able to find room for his growing population. That fellow has kept Italy on the upgrade for all these years, and all the time everybody says, 'Oh, he can't last.' I have said ever since I met him in 26 that he was by far the greatest guy I had ever met, and there has never been a day since then that I have changed. He has done more for his country than any man ever did for one in a lifetime. You don't see him shooting at him anymore, do you? He is a whiz, that baby is. I have never yet seen him propose a fool thing." After he died in a plane crash, Rogers was replaced at the top of the box office charts by Shirley Temple, whose breakthrough film was Stand Up and Cheer, released by Fox in 1934. In the film, the President of the United States, who looks very much like Franklin Roosevelt, appoints a Secretary of Amusement to cheer up the country. The Secretary recruits vaudeville acts, in opposition to a gloomy group of businessmen called the Blue Noses, who have a financial interest in prolonging the Depression. His star performer is a 4-year-old girl, played by Temple, who wins over the nation with her singing. At the end of the film, a crowd shouts into the camera, "The Depression is over! Men are going back to work!" Another staple of post-code New Deal Hollywood was a series of films made by Frank Capra for Columbia Pictures in the late 1930s and early 1940s, most famously Mr. Deeds Goes to Town in 1936 and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington in 1939. The typical Capra film featured a hero much like Will Rogers, whose close-knit and cooperative small town is threatened either by greedy capitalists or by corrupt politicians. As the University of Maryland historian Gary Gerstle has put it, Capra's films both drew on and contributed to the reform civic nationalism that was so crucial to the success of Roosevelt and his New Deal. New Deal films presented an American version of the folk ethos that was developed in Germany in the 19th century. According to many German philosophers, authors, artists, and folklorists, the spirit of a nation was determined by those who were organically connected to its soil and traditions. This usually meant those who literally worked the land, who sacrificed themselves for the community and eschewed luxury, and whose ancestry could be traced to the nation's founding. In 20th century Germany, this concept produced hostility to ethnic groups who were not the Nordic or Aryan people of Northern Europe, city dwellers, merchants, and others who did not work with their hands, and democratic institutions that treated the folk and other inferior races as equals. The Nazi built their ideology around this concept. Life is an act of sacrifice for the sake of our neighbor, wrote Joseph Goebbels of the Folk. And my neighbor is he who has the same blood.